Now that we've finished the psychodynamic and psychoanalytic perspectives and theories, we want to turn our attention now to the humanistic theories. And this is Module 41, and you need to distinguish, I guess would be a way to say this, distinguish the humanistic theory from humanism itself, although they have a lot of crossover and overlap. Essentially, this perspective emphasizes the growth potential of healthy people, and that's really who we're looking at here is Abraham Maslow, and he did most of his work on healthy people, and so he's not looking at a little bit like Freud did. Freud looked at people that were disordered, had displayed disordered behavior. Maslow, on the other hand, actually looked at and examined healthy people and what leads to their growth and potential and the living out of their potential. Essentially, and just as a reiteration, because we've talked a little bit about this already, is that Maslow believed that human needs, once met, leads to essentially higher and higher levels of functioning, if you will. So, and it's a built-in assumption into his theory itself, and informed the other theorists, which we'll look at here shortly, and that is Carl Rogers. And so the underlying assumption is that once these needs are met, then people will naturally gravitate toward higher and higher levels of functioning, and that's built into Rogers as well. So essentially, the other key term, which we've already mentioned because we looked at this in development, is the whole idea of self-actualization. It's at the nearly at the top of the pyramid needs of pyramid, or hierarchy of needs, I should say, that Maslow suggested. And essentially, it's fulfilling, or the need to, or the motivation to fulfill one's potential. And of course, this term, if you will, potential, is really quite abstract. How do we know what one's potential actually is? And then the second item, which is at the top, was also self-transcendence, and that's essentially engaging in things that in which we find meaning and purpose beyond myself, and that's self-transcendence. So Maslow and Rogers both were key figures in this humanistic theories themselves. It is in terms of what Maslow sees it, he saw it as one of the ultimate psychological needs that arises after the physical and psychological needs are met, and that's what he was referring to as self-transcendence and self-actualization. The other key person, which I've already mentioned, is Carl Rogers. And Carl Rogers, for many of you, you're at the beginning of your career at CCU, and eventually I will have you again in the clinical counseling methods, and we'll talk at far more length about Carl Rogers himself, because he developed a mode of doing counseling called client-centered. Now it's called person-centered therapy, and essentially he agreed mostly with Maslow, and he believed that a couple different things. One is people are basically good, and there is a cute little cartoon in your book that looks like a conversation between Satan and a demon. And the demon basically says, we were doing a pretty brisk business considering that everybody is basically good. And the second thing that Rogers talks about is that people are endowed with self-actualizing tendencies. And what that means is that essentially people have within them the drive toward self-actualization. Tendencies. So essentially, what does that mean? If people are endowed with these self-actualizing tendencies, then why is it that their growth remains stunted? And in Rogers' point of view, environmental and other obstacles stand in the way of and other obstacles stand in the way of people achieving their self-actualization. And usually the nature of the beast, if you will, is that we begin to look at whether it's internal things or external things that get in the way of me actually moving toward growth. Now, if we're assuming that man is basically good, then essentially the way to help people is really just helping them to remove obstacles. And that's part of Rogers' attempt to examine and help people grow. And so Rogers is really a key part in essentially the effort now is to nurture growth, which is important in helping people find their self-actualizing potentials. The other thing, the other fourth item I wanted to mention to you about Carl Rogers is what he called 3 necessary and sufficient conditions for growth in human relationship. And these included, well, didn't include, these were, and let me just put it up here, is unconditional positive regard, otherwise known as acceptance. So we have, first of all, acceptance, which in some respects, obviously, it is provided for us in our faith and through Scripture. We are accepted by God through Christ, and that God has made sure that we have that firm affirmation by a relationship with Christ. The second one is what he called unconditional positive regard, which really ended up being a synonym for acceptance, regard. Another one was also genuineness. I need to be in a relationship with someone who I know is what you see is what you get. They're genuine, they're authentic. And then the last one was empathy, and empathy, being able to see the world through another's eyes, not through my eyes that I say that's what they're seeing, but I understand them and their perspective enough to be able to understand how they see things. And so the core concept, one of the core concepts for developing and I'm going to make a little box over here so that I can just fill this in the rest of the way. The core concept really is self-concept, and we will look at this in the 3rd chapter in this series, but essentially to develop a deeper self-awareness and a more realistic self-concept, we need these conditions according to Rogers. And so this has become the hallmark of existence for most people today, particularly in what one author calls the I world. So the self-concept needs these 3 conditions that are part of our emotional and psychological well-being, and I'll just point downward. And I need to, in order to achieve the self-actualization, I have to develop an increasing level of positive self-concept. And Rogers, of all the theorists, probably did the most research on the self-concept and how we tend to have either we make a comparison between our ideal self and real self, which leads to a decrease in self-concept. And that's part of the backdrop here when we're talking about Maslow and Rogers and their influence on the humanistic theories themselves.